So, Katherine Eban is an investigative journalist, Fortune magazine contributor, and Andrew Carnegie Fellow. Her articles on the pharmaceutical counterfeiting, gun trafficking, and interrogations about CIA have won international attention and numerous awards. She's written for Vanity Fair, the New York Times, Self, The Nation, the New York Observer, and other publications. Her work has been featured on 60 Minutes, Nightline, NPR, and she also has written other books, and she's a very highly acclaimed writer, and award-winning writer, and we're very happy to have her talk about this book right here, Bottle of Lies. I read it. It's a good book. And I hope you'll read it. And okay, so I wanted to start off with what's in the news, Zantac. So the brand isn't good, the generic's not good. So anyway, well, tell me, you spent 5 years on this book. What got you to do that?
Oh, okay. So firstly, I'd just like to say thank you to Chip and Susan Fisher for bringing me here into their beautiful home to talk to everyone. Thank you, David, and to SWINY for reaching out and yeah. Oh, let's get rid of that. Yeah. So thank you very much. It's great to be here. Let's put Zantac aside and start with how this project began. It was 2008, and I got a very curious phone call from the host of an NPR radio program called The People's Pharmacy, Joe Graydon. And I'd been on his program before to talk about other stories I'd done. He said to me, I am getting all of these complaints from patients. They're saying their generics don't work, or that they're having terrible side effects. Joe is a pharmacologist, so he had some, sort of way of scrutinizing these complaints. He said he'd gone to the FDA, brought complaints to top officials, and basically their response was, well, it's psychosomatic because the shape and color of the pill changes when they're switched from a brand to generic, so it's in their heads, but everything's fine. So he was really skeptical of that claim. And he said to me, we need someone with investigative firepower to dig into this. And he basically posed a single question to me: what is wrong with the drugs? So that is the phone call that launched me on this decade-long reporting odyssey.
So, what is wrong with the drugs?
Thank you. That's a good question. It took me 10 years to figure it out. If you don't mind, let me talk a little bit more about the reporting journey and how I began to try to answer that. So I started exactly where Joe Graydon pointed me, with the patients. So the patients were easy to find. There were people who had gone on terrible medical odysseys. Once they were switched, they didn't realize it was due to a switch. There were doctors who were concerned, especially doctors who prescribe narrow therapeutic index drugs where precise dosing is really important. So that was all easy to find. Sure, like endocrinologists or neurologists, psychiatrists, cardiologists, they're prescribing drugs where small variations in dosing can be a life or death issue for their patients. The head of the American Psychiatric Association said to me, we're satisfied, the FDA is satisfied that generics are fine, but are we satisfied? So I did that article, and I was not satisfied, because I felt, oh, all right, even if the patients are complaining, sorry about all the feedback, even if the patients are complaining and the doctors are unhappy, what is wrong with the drugs? It didn't tell me anything. So after that article came out, I was contacted by a whistleblower who was anonymous, and he called himself $4 refill, which is, of course, what you would pay if you're filling a prescription at a Walmart. And he began talking to me about the financial motivations inside the generic industry. And he talked about the incentives for being first to market with a drug. And that's an incentive that's called first to file, which is the first generic company that puts down an application with the FDA that gets approved gets 6 months exclusivity on the market. And basically his allegation was that that is leading companies to falsify their data to shorten the time that the application takes to fill out, altering their data, shortening the testing processes to be first. And lo and behold, it turned out that the race to be first was so intense, and not just minutes mattered, seconds mattered. Who was first through the door mattered, that the generic companies would line up in the FDA parking lot. They bring in stretch limos. Their executives would take turns sleeping in the limos. They pitched tents. There were tent cities in the FDA parking lot in order to be first. So that's what I began looking at. Should I talk a little more about the journey, or is that, yeah. So once I started looking into this, I heard about a company called Ranbaxy. It was India's largest drug company at the time. It was a, sort of a household name in India. I had never heard of it, but it was a huge company. And it was under investigation by the FDA for falsifying its data. So it was a very intense criminal investigation at the time, and it had been sparked by a whistleblower named Dinesh Thakur, who had been a senior executive at Ranbaxy. And his boss became, who was new to the company, became suspicious about the quality of the company's data. And he gave him an assignment. He says, I want you to examine all the regulatory filings of this company worldwide, your own company. I want you to delve into these applications and see if the data is real or if it's fake. So Dinesh began investigating this, and he uncovered this horrible truth about Ranbaxy, which is that for more than 200 products in more than 40 countries, including in the US, they had faked their data, in some cases completely inventing it. Sometimes they would take brand name drugs, they'd run tests off the brand name drugs, and take that data and present it as though they had tested their own drugs. So, yeah.
How were you even able to find that out? How did you find that out?
It's the Pharaohs story.
Yeah, it is kind of,
That you have to buy the book for that.
yeah, you kind of do, I mean, let me put it this way. This was a global jigsaw puzzle that I was assembling over the course of a decade, trying to connect dots between patient complaints, FDA findings, regulatory filings of the companies, whistleblowers inside the companies, and ultimately what I think is the heart of the story is the decisions that executives were making inside of these companies. Because ultimately I feel this is not well, it is a consumer story, but it's really a corporate crime story. The book is a corporate crime story.
So she's got an interesting cast of characters in the book, starting with Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Bill Clinton, Orrin Hatch, who else? George W. Bush, who's kind of a hero for AIDS in Africa, John McCain, I'm forgetting some other people, but a lot of famous people involved in this generic drug industry. And a lot of it has to do with AIDS and the desire to get cheap AIDS drugs to Africa. And even Doctors Without Borders said that when the questions are raised about the issues, said that we'd rather get a cheap drug than no drug at all. So I thought that was very, very interesting. And what was it called? It was called $4 or something like that?
The $4 refill.
$4 retail.
Yeah.
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 So why don't you talk about some of these characters and how they got involved and whether they're good guys or bad guys or something.
A cheap drug that doesn't work over nothing?
Well, some of them, I mean, they don't work as well. I mean, they do, some of them work. You know, you can address that. I mean, some of them work. I mean, we all take generics.
Right, I mean, so, you know, you know what, let me talk about the famous people and then we'll come back to this question because it's really critical.
Sure, could you please explain the difference between the trade name drug and the generic? I think that might be helpful.
Okay, so,
Okay.
yeah. So, a brand name company is also referred to as an innovator company. So they innovate and basically sort of invent or create this molecule in the laboratory and figure out how to formulate it and how to create a finished dose that is stable and that dissolves appropriately in the body and has the desired result. That drug will be under patent. They will surround their drug with a sort of army of patents. They'll patent everything, every manufacturing step. They can patent the time-release formulation, and so they're going to make it as difficult as possible to create a generic. A generic company comes along and it has two choices. It can wait until the patent lapses, or it can file what's called a paragraph 4 challenge to the brand name drug to basically say the patent isn't legitimate for X, Y, and Z reasons, and fight it out in court. Sometimes that results in a settlement where then the generic can make the drug.
So I'll just give a few samples, like, you know, Zoloft, you know, Viagra, you know, Lipitor. So those are the trade names. So Zoloft's generic would be sertraline, Lipitor is atorvastatin, and you know, and so on. So, you know, doctors they don't write you prescriptions for Lipitor anymore, or Zoloft, they write you prescriptions for the generic. Because I think 85% of all drugs prescribed in America are generics. 90, okay.
90%, yeah, oh yeah.
Okay, now it's 90.
Yeah. Another thing to say about that is that the FDA has what is called a bioequivalence standard, which says that it recognizes that the generic is not an exact copy. It's going to be a version, and they basically say it has to fall. There's a statistical formula that's complex, but by and large, it has to fall within 20% below or 25% above the absorption into the blood of the brand name drug, which many doctors feel is a too big a range. So there can be a lot of variation. So there can be a lot of variation if you switch from a brand to generic or if you switch between different generics. You may be getting, you know, that kind of clinical experience, basically. Yeah. Yeah. So the famous people. So the book does a deep dive into the history of the generic drug industry, and in India, Gandhi had gone to a chemist named Hamid when the British were occupying India, and basically said because of World War II, drug supplies from Europe had collapsed, and they needed the Indians to step up and make drugs for the Indian army. And if they were able to do that, the British might look favorably upon giving them independence. So there was a bit of a quid pro quo in there. But that was really the sort of birth or genesis of the Indian industry. And then there was another very favorable court ruling which said, you can make a drug that's under patent. You're allowed to do that, but you have to vary the manufacturing steps. So instead of doing A, B, C, D, E, you you have to do A, E, D, C, like that. And so that gave rise to a sort of Indian specialty of reverse engineering, where they were very capable chemists who were able to figure out how to get around these patents by changing the manufacturing steps of a drug. So reverse engineering it in the lab and making it differently. Fast forward to the AIDS crisis, and Hamid's son, Yusuf Hamid, was so alarmed by the AIDS crisis that he announced that he was working with a group of activists from the West. He announced that he was going to make the AIDS cocktail of drugs, which was 3 drugs still under patent. He was going to charge basically the price of $1 a day for those drugs, which led to a huge battle with Big Pharma. But the end result was that George W. Bush stepped forward and said, this is too great an opportunity to ignore. We're going to create a program called PEPFAR, which is going to buy AIDS drugs from the Indians using taxpayer dollars and sell it and send it to Africa to address the AIDS crisis. But the only caveat of that was it needs to be FDA approved, because otherwise how do we know that we're not sending fake AIDS drugs? Once some of these drugs started getting FDA approval, everybody was like, well, wait a second. These drugs are getting FDA approved. Nobody here can afford brand name drugs anyway. Why don't we take them too? And that was really the beginning of the generic drug boom in the US.
So how do generic, except for the, I know about the 6-month, thing, but how do generic drugs make money if, if people are selling it here for $5,000 and they're selling it for $4? I was surprised, they're billionaires, these people, all these people. How are they making the money?
So that is one of the central issues that I investigated, is how do they make money? Basically, following good manufacturing practices, which you are required to do, has a significant cost. So if you can basically not follow good manufacturing practices and essentially undercut your own product and sell into markets that require GMP standards, you are going to make a profit.
A lot of money.
You're going to make a lot of money. Yeah.
So what about the Clinton Foundation?
So one of the things that the Clinton, in many ways, this is a very positive story in the sense that if the drugs worked and if they were great, it's a miracle story, right? Generic drugs are a great equalizer as far as health goes. What the Clinton Foundation did is, in the wake of the PEPFAR program, they came in, they aggregated the demand for these drugs from African governments. They worked with the Indian drug makers, and they got the price of the cocktail down to about 38 cents a day. But there was a big debate inside the US government. How do we know that these drugs are what they say they are? And FDA review and approval was supposed to answer that question.
So, when I read this book, I worked for Pfizer. I've actually also done work for PEPFAR through the Bill Gates Foundation. And I was reading this book and I was saying I felt the FDA has really let people down worldwide. That the FDA has let people down. Part of it's not their fault. I mean, in the United States, they can do an inspection of the factory. Nobody knows they're coming. When you go abroad, they have to, it's not part of the U.S. government. They have to let them know in advance that they're coming. So they clean up, and they hide records, and they do all these things. So I guess, this is my last question to you, and then I'm going to turn it over to people here. Do we trust the FDA?
a lot of this book is built on 20,000 confidential FDA records that I got. Memos, emails, internal documents, emails from whistleblowers to officials there. And I would say that, you know, my takeaway from reviewing all of this and writing this book is no. We don't trust the FDA. I mean, the FDA has made the claim that they have this situation under control, that they have a perfect or, you know, good enough review system, whether the drug is being made in, you know, Ohio or Shandong, China. But in fact, they are regulating these drugs on an honor system. So basically, they are getting data from these companies. A lot of the data is fabricated. They're reviewing the data. Then they do a pre-approval inspection, but the inspections are pre-announced. And these companies literally bring in data fabrication teams to shred documents, falsify documents, invent documents like, just to give you an anecdote, they invent standard operating procedures that they were supposed to already have. And in one instance, a company steamed those in a room overnight to make the documents look old. You know, they ship incriminating records out of the plant before they come. They, you know, clean up bird infestations. I have photographs, if you go on my Twitter feed, of, you know, snakes in laboratories, live bugs in pills. And I would say that no, the FDA does not have the situation under control.
So we don't have much of a choice but to take generics, and you know, insurance companies won't pay for it. So what do you advise people? I mean, we talk about this. You said you take generics. I mean, we don't have much of a choice, right?
Yeah.
So what do we do? I mean, I know that Pfizer has its own little generic maker called Greenstone. So, and I know that they manufacture the Xanax and the Lipitor in the same place, and the generic in the same place. So I try and get that brand if I can. But beyond that, like other drugs you take, you got to manufacture them. What are you going to do?
So I have gotten this question so much since the book came out that on my website I put out a guide to investigating your own drugs. So step by step, how you figure out who's made your drugs, what the track record of that company is, what you do if you want to switch, what are your options for switching, figuring out who else is making the drug, whether there is what's called an authorized generic, which is actually the best secret deal in town. Often what brand name companies do is, in order to hold on to a piece of market share, they will make the brand name drug but have a distributor basically sell it under a different label. So it's literally the brand name drug at a generic price, which can be a very attractive option.
Like a factory outlet. Like a factory.
Just one. The last thing I want to say is that brand name drugs, they do get ingredients from other countries that are suspect. So, okay, so I see people raising their hands and they want to talk. I'll start with people in the back. Sheila?
What about
Or just project.
What about Canadian, like, my doctor told me once to contact Canada, is that a safer option, or is it cheaper, or?
So here, first of all, let me say this about, you know, I don't know where this myth of, you know, Canadian drugs, there's a lot of snow there, everything's pure and white, it's gotta be good. But if you are getting quote unquote Canadian drugs from an online pharmacy, there is probably in tiny little print something that says, if we don't have it in stock, you authorize us to get it from our offshore partners. And basically, let me tell you, you never want drugs from an offshore partner. To me, that is not a safe option. Maybe if you're talking about going to a brick and mortar pharmacy in Canada, but to me, we have to solve the problems of our own drug supply here, and this Canada thing is not cutting it.
Harvey?
Yeah, I'm a physician who also takes some drugs, and there are two people you can personally talk to. Your physician, who might know which drug to take, but frequently doesn't. And then your pharmacist, who could be a very, very good source, and ask him if it's a generic, which generic he would like. If you could trust your pharmacist, not pharmacy tech, but a pharmacist who today are mostly doctoral level degrees, and they would know that these generics are bad, or they should know. That's just a quick thing.
Yeah, but then the question is, you may not have them on their formulary or in stock. That's a
So the
problem.
pharmacist will have the drug.
Not,
Not necessarily.
no, it may not be on your formulary.
Oh, your formulary.
Go ahead.
I actually have two questions. One, you mentioned that the book really is, it's about corporate malfeasance, right? It's not just it is about generic drugs, but in general. So one question, through this process, have you been approached or are considering either looking at the regular, the non-generic drugs, pharmaceutical industry, and or another corporate practice? And my second question is, how is an author uncovering all of this ugliness do you control rage?
I don't.
Well, first of all, regarding brand name drugs, I have been an investigative journalist for 20 plus years, so I have done my fair share of investigating of the brand name drug industry. And I will say, I keep trying to stop writing about pharmaceuticals, which is almost impossible because it's kind of like, I hate to say this, we've got pharma reps, it's a little like investigating the mob. I mean, there's just a lot of stories there and a lot of sources. So, the fact that this book exists is not an endorsement of the brand name drug industry. It's not saying brand name drugs are perfect and safe. And it's been my impression over all these years that there is so much fraud in the sales and marketing departments of brand name drugs, but this kind of fraud in the laboratories, literally changing data, inventing documents, seems to me much more widespread in the generic drug industry, basically because of some of the incentives. As far as controlling the rage, I would say I'm much more motivated by, I refuse to be stumped. That's really what it is. That's my motivation. And when Joe Graydon said to me, what's wrong with the drugs? I was like, what's wrong with the drugs? And the problem was it just took me so long to figure it out. But it's more curiosity than rage, I would say. And I will also say this, which is I don't have a science or medical background. I have a master's in 17th century poetry. Of course. And I studied Paradise Lost, of course, which is all about good and evil. But the really distinctive feature of Paradise Lost is that Satan is so interesting and God is such a bore. And I find that true in investigative journalism, that the bad guys are so fascinating. So I cheer right up when I'm investigating a bad guy.
Okay. Up there?
Hi. So I think the book is going to be really so fascinating, and I have to buy it and read it. But I had one question. In the news a little while ago, there was this whole scandal about compounding pharmacies, and then they have this other thing called, I think they're called biologics. So they're not exactly that drug molecule, they're a little bit. Do you have any insight on those couple things?
So, the compounding pharmacies were a disaster, and there was a huge scandal around. It was, I think, the New England Compounding Center, and basically, it's sort of a repeated story. The FDA is an underfunded industry. They are timid, and they don't have enough authority. And basically, they get effective regulations after there is a catastrophe. So that's the compounding story. Biologics or biosimilars is what they're called. They're coming. They're almost here. They're coming. And there's just a huge question about if we can't get the simple, supposedly easy to make small molecule generics right, how is the FDA gonna regulate biosimilars? So I think that is like a train wreck we can see coming a long way off.
Right?
So thinking about how to fix the situation, right? There are two ways to go. One would be basically punishments, and the other would be change the incentives, right? What do you see as possible, one or two moves that might change the landscape?
There's a lot of changes that I could envision. So the first is you have to end this honor system that the FDA is regulating on. You need unannounced inspections wherever in the world the inspections take place, and you need systematic, random surveillance testing of drugs. This whole thing about Zantac, which you mentioned at the start, that's blown up. All of this stuff about the blood pressure medicines that have carcinogens in them. All of this is the result of the fact that there's no surveillance testing of our drugs. That shocks people when they hear that, but it doesn't exist. Another thing that I think is an important piece of this is more information for the consumer. So, country of origin labeling. You go into Whole Foods and you know where your apple came from, and you have a tag on your clothing that tells you where it was made. And I think that there should be country of origin labeling both for active ingredient and finished doses. I think a lot of good would come of turning the Klieg lights on in the drug supply, and it could also perhaps force a return to manufacturing in this country. I mean, right now we get 80% of all of our active ingredient in all our drugs, brand or generic, from overseas. Majority from China. We get 40% of our generic finished doses from India. The Pentagon just testified at a U.S.-China Commission hearing that I testified at as well, that this is a national security issue, right? If I'm not going to get political here, but if our president, pisses off the Chinese enough and they say, that's it, we're withholding your antibiotics, we're toast. So I think we need more transparency.
Hi, I have sort of a practical journalism question, which is twofold. So you mentioned that thousands of records that you got from the FDA that you're based your work on. So one question is, how do you get those in such a way that they actually give you information you need and not white it, 50% of it? And two, if FDA has falsified data, then where do you get the real data? Just whistleblowers or somehow different?
That's a craft question.
Yeah. I did get some information from Freedom of Information, so I filed 16 Freedom of Information requests and even tried my hand at suing the FDA, which worked reasonably well. Yeah. But the majority of the documents, the real 20,000 tranche of documents, came from confidential sources. Basically, over time, convincing people that, if I didn't tell this story, it was unlikely that other people were going to tell this story, and that there was a public health imperative, and that is how I got the documents. Yeah.
Manage the logistics of that, like where did you store the documents, or just things like that. That's evidence.
Well, my answer to that is you should see my office. Oh my God, it's insane. They're all there, and I will say this, which is So the book, because of, we got a lot of threats from the industry before the book came out. So Harper Collins decided to embargo the book, which meant that there were no galleys floating around. Obviously I asked all the companies that there were allegations against, asked them for comment. So on that basis, they hired a lot of the lawyers. They began taking my garbage. Somebody was watching my house because our garbage kept disappearing. I have a huge shredder, but the garbage was disappearing. And we just had to be extremely cautious. So it was very, very difficult to sort of handle all of that, safeguard the documents, store them safely, handle them safely.
You should have come to hear Gretchen Rubin talk about order in her column.
Well, I'll add one more thing. This is slightly off color, but we have a 187-pound Newfoundland who's a real love bug. But I think when they collected the garbage, they encountered his daily routines, more evidence of his daily routines than documents.
I wanted to thank you for writing the book, and it's a wonderful, if you haven't read it yet, I started out thinking, why would I be interested in this? And within 5 pages, I was riveted and terrified and running off to check my migraine medicine and finding in tiny, tiny print that it was made in India. I think any writer who reads the book realizes that you just put in an amazing, amazing amount of really painstaking research. It's mind-boggling. So just 2 quick questions. One is, why haven't we heard more about this? I mean, I think the feeling in the room is everybody's like, oh my God, are my drugs safe? But until I read your book, I hadn't heard anything about this. The second question is, did you have access to any of the factories in India? Because the descriptions made me feel as if I were seeing the bugs and the snakes and the terrible conditions, but I can't imagine anybody actually granted you access, so I'm just really curious about that.
First of all, why haven't we heard more about this? The FDA's position is, if they have approved it, the drugs are safe. And they really haven't changed that position. And I've found that because of that, we really don't think much. We go to a pharmacy, we get a drug. We don't even pay attention to who manufactured it because we believe that they're all interchangeable, So I think that we're a bit anesthetized, and also we don't have a consumer option. It's not like you do more research for your cell phone contract or your car, but it's not like you're researching your drugs and figuring out what manufacturer you want to take, because we basically don't have a choice. And a lot of us are locked into formularies through mail order or big corporate pharmacies. So that's why I think we haven't heard much about it. And also because it is incredibly hard to connect all these dots. It is a global jigsaw puzzle. And unless somebody as crazy as me wants to spend 10 years doing it, it's, we're not going to figure it out, basically.
You want to go with people who have not asked?
Oh, sorry, we just answer quickly. The factories, I went to some and got some dog and pony shows, but a lot of the recreations come from whistleblower documents. So I have a number of whistleblowers inside the industry. They gave me pictures, reports, internal reports, and I reconstructed it that way.
If you haven't asked a question.
So this level of ineptitude in the FDA has been in existence for decades, regardless of which party is in control? Yeah, okay. And then my other question has to do with, which is sad, but true, Theranos, and is that just a microcosm of this entire story?
The deceit general.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you should mention that. Has anybody seen the Theranos documentary? Yeah, I watched that recently, and that was kind of a a case of over-promising gone wild, and so, a fraud begat a fraud. I would say that, the fraud that I uncovered, which was really industry-wide, this is not just about one bad company, is really a kind of based on a structural profit model of how to make the biggest amount of profit by making the cheapest, lowest quality drugs possible.
I have two questions. Who funded your work, and did it include any drug makers? And did you look at WHO's role?
So that's a question I've gotten a lot, and because of that, I have a nice big statement on my website which says I did not take one dime from any company at all, and certainly no company or grantor that had any stake in the outcome of this book. So my funding came from an advance from my publisher, Harper Collins, and then principally 4 grants, the Andrew Carnegie Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and 2 other journalism grants. And just also trying to gracefully go broke.
Any comment on WHO's role?
Oh, WHO's one.
So part of the issue with WHO, and I do talk a little bit about them, is that they have what's called a pre-qualified list. So they, it's a kind of it's a regulatory structure where they do go and inspect these plants. And while some of those inspections are useful, it's clear that they're not adequate. They're not sufficient because a lot of these companies are really tricking the World Health Organization.
Catherine, we know that over the last 25 years, federal government's policy has been to loosen FDA regulation, beginning in the 90s and then going through the 21st Century Cures Act, which passed a couple of years ago. Is there anything that you can glean from this, what I like to call the weakening of the FDA over this time period, that relates to what you have found with the generic drug manufacturing? And can you relate that in terms of what we can see as consumers, because the public doesn't know what's happened to the FDA over this time period?
So I found some really astonishing things related to what you have asked. So the FDA wants to go to Congress and say, we're approving these low-cost drugs, the approvals are increasing, and the supply of low-cost drugs are increasing. And that is an FDA imperative, and they're also partially getting funded by doing that. So they get approval fees from the industry. So the whole thing is incentivized to create a kind of chain of continued ongoing approvals. One thing that was really startling that I uncovered was that the FDA is systematically downgrading the recommended sanctions of its own inspectors, particularly in the Indian and Chinese plants. So these inspectors are going into the plants, they're reporting back to FDA headquarters, we found terrible things, we recommend what's called official action indicated, which is the most stringent sanction, and that their findings enter a review process at FDA headquarters, and those recommendations are downgraded.
Why?
Okay,
I'm
of
going to
course.
take hostess. So my question is, now that this book has come out, are you persona non grata at the FDA? I mean, will you never be able to write about, have access, have you had blowback from the government?
Well, I think I was persona non grata before the book. I'm pretty sure they don't like me anymore now. But I will say that, it is really something to be reporting in the Trump era. because prior to this, you know, my experience at least is that federal agencies, they may not have liked you or wanted much to help you, but I think they did feel like they had to respond and deal with you. But I think there is a contempt for the press that has really trickled down, and the result of that is that you get no access and no information. You know, when I compare, I did a big Fortune magazine article in 2013, and I reached out to the FDA. They weren't happy to talk to me, but I went down there, I sat around an oval conference table with like 10 people, and they gave me an hour. That was amazing. There's nothing like that now. So I got really no access, no response, basically a kind of no comment, and they did not really engage much.
It's kind of, I find that particularly interesting because these are career people working in government agencies regardless of who the administration is. So I mean, that's why I was kind of curious.
Right.
You know, as in many of the departments,
Yeah.
since this, I mean, I didn't think it was particular to this administration, but that's interesting because now these careerists are taking a new tack, which they never did before.
Well, but remember that the careerists, the people at the top change. So political people come in to supervise the careerists, and you know, you have to get past the political people to talk to the careerists, and you can't get access. So that's part of the problem.
I'm going to stop. Okay. One last question. One of my editors is here.
It's not my hand in.
But,
I'd just like to thank you also for all the work that was put into the book. I mean, just incredible. But I have two questions actually with my one question. So, brand name drugs versus generic. When somebody's taking a $15,000 a month cancer drug, what confidence can they have in the integrity of that drug? And the second question is, your background was in poetry. What you did was some really sophisticated reporting.
Yeah.
How did you learn all that?
I have a master's in creative writing from Johns Hopkins.
There you go. So I guess the first question about, you know, brand versus generic, the $15,000 a month drug, it's clear to me that we're all really at the mercy of we depend on the vigilance of the company that is making the finished dose. That is the company that we're going to rely on to do testing of active ingredients, to audit suppliers, you know, and the more worried that company is about its reputation, about getting sued, I would say the sort of safer the consumer might be. And I think, you know, a U.S. brand name drug company is more concerned about consumers, regulators, media, lawyers than a generic company in India, which doesn't mean that one is perfect and the other is not, but that's just my belief. And how did I learn how to do this? Over the course of many years, I think it is something that I have a kind of instinct for, and then I have just sort of trained myself, worked with amazing editors over the years and amazing colleagues, and attended great conferences and just worked my way through it.
okay, so we're going to end. Katherine